I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's July 9th, and we have a lot to talk about. Two of the things that we've highlighted in past episodes of the podcast have been the importance of getting an early MS diagnosis, as well as the reality that for many people, especially people in underserved communities, that early diagnosis isn't likely going to happen. Which means that based upon your ethnic, racial, or socioeconomic status, you're much more likely to experience a worse disease course. And that just seems fundamentally wrong. The inequities associated with gaining access to quality health care are often discussed. And today we're going to talk with someone who's taken steps to do something about it. My guest today is Dr. Jaime Imitola, the director of the Division of Multiple Sclerosis and Translational Neuroimmunology at UCONN Health. Dr. Imitola and his team have created a tool called VISBL-MS, a bilingual framework for early MS awareness. And if you're curious about what all that means and how it's going to be implemented, you won't want to miss my conversation with Dr. Imitola. But before we get to that conversation, there are a few other things that you should know about. PIRA has become an increasingly popular acronym among MS clinicians and researchers. Spelled PIRA, it stands for Progression Independent of Relapse Activity. And in spite of PIRA apparently having its moment among the MS research and clinical community, it isn't a new phenomenon. If you'd like to learn a bit more about PIRA, I'll invite you to listen to my conversation with Professor Alan Thompson in episode 339 of Real Talk MS, and I'll include a link to that episode in today's show notes. We're talking about PIRA today because a research team in France has published results of a study that demonstrate how common progression independent of relapse activity in multiple sclerosis might actually be. An MS relapse is triggered by new disease activity in the central nervous system, like the appearance of a new lesion or an existing lesion that may be changing or growing larger. This new disease activity is typically confirmed by analyzing an MRI scan. So in this study, the research team set out to understand the association between an MS relapse and the disease activity captured in an MRI scan. They analyzed 637 MRI scans that preceded or followed an MS relapse among 608 people living with MS between January 2015 and June 2023. All of this data came from the French MS registry. And the researchers discovered that in just over 26% of all the relapse data analyzed, there was no change in the MRI scan. They also pointed out that this occurred most frequently among people who were on a high-efficacy disease-modifying therapy. So in slightly more than a quarter of the cases, someone analyzing the MRI scans from these patients would have pronounced them as having stable disease. Yet, they were experiencing relapses. Or to put it in more popular language, they were experiencing PIRA, progression independent of relapse activity. It's not new, but as scientists develop new ways to better identify the physiological mechanisms that drive multiple sclerosis, we can expect to see new therapies designed to target these as yet undiscovered mechanisms. If you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. When we look at much of the existing evidence that supports stem cell therapy as a treatment for MS, it appears that so far the best candidates for this treatment are people who have been diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS for a relatively short time, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 years. And these are people who usually aren't experiencing seriously disabling symptoms. I've always considered it a sad irony that what continues to be shown as such a promising treatment for some hasn't been shown to be particularly effective among the people living with progressive MS, the people who, in my admittedly biased opinion, need this sort of treatment the most. Now, evidence from a small proof-of-concept study in Italy may stimulate further research into how stem cell therapy may deliver benefits to people with progressive MS. In this study, researchers injected neural stem cells directly into the brains of 15 people with progressive MS. Neural stem cells are stem cells with the ability to develop into brain cells. And these 15 study participants were all experiencing severe disease, typically requiring a wheelchair for mobility at the time they received this stem cell therapy. Over a 12-month period following the neural stem cell injection, none of the 15 study participants experienced physical or cognitive worsening, which is not typical of progressive MS patients, where symptom worsening is ongoing. The research team also observed that a higher dose of stem cells was associated with less brain atrophy among the study participants. Most of the 15 study participants still showed evidence of disease activity on MRI scans, suggesting that this treatment only partially suppressed brain inflammation. Now, I'll repeat that this was a very small study, and there was no control group to compare the outcome against. So there's a lot more work to be done here, including initiating larger studies. Having said that, this therapy was well tolerated with few side effects, and my own personal experience has shown that being able to stop symptom progression for a year is a meaningful gain to someone who's living with progressive MS. I'm hopeful that we'll see next steps taken in exploring the benefits of a therapeutic pathway that may show stem cell therapy to be a viable treatment for people with progressive MS. And if you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. Finding a blood-based biomarker to measure or predict disease activity in MS continues to be a priority for many researchers. Of late, the leading candidate has been neurofilament light chain, which is a protein that's released into the bloodstream when there's nerve damage in the central nervous system, as occurs in MS. Just last week, I told you about a blood test that's been cleared for use in Europe that will measure neurofilament light chain levels in people with MS. Now, a research team has identified a panel of 20 proteins that can be measured in the blood that's been shown to be more accurate than neurofilament light chain alone in quantifying MS disease activity. The research team analyzed more than 1,400 proteins in more than 600 blood samples taken from 3 different groups of MS patients. And in their analysis, the researchers used a whole battery of statistical tests to look for proteins that could predict MS disease activity. The research team defined MS disease activity in 3 different ways: whether or not patients had active inflamed lesions at the time the blood sample was drawn, whether or not patients were in or near a relapse when the blood sample was drawn, and the annual relapse rate of each patient. From these analyses, the team identified this panel of 20 proteins that, when analyzed together, could consistently predict MS disease activity. Based on these findings, the researchers suggested that by analyzing a blood test against this panel of proteins, a clinician could gain insights into how a patient was responding to their treatment before those insights could be gained through MRI. Not to mention that a simple blood test is far less burdensome than having to endure an MRI exam. And beyond the clinic, understanding how an individual is responding to a specific treatment early could ultimately shrink the time needed for clinical trials, making potential treatments available sooner. The team noted that this was an early analysis and indicated that further long-term studies are needed to validate their findings. But this study brings us another step closer to identifying a reliable blood-based biomarker for MS disease activity that could benefit scientists in clinical trials and people with MS in the clinic. If you'd like to review the details of this study, You'll find a link in today's show notes. We're a little more than 2 weeks away from Crush MS, an event that combines wine, food, music, and fun in Napa Valley, California to raise money for MS research. I'm planning to be at Crush MS, and if you think you might enjoy a summer afternoon in California's wine country, enjoying great wine from 24 Napa Valley wineries, amazing food, and live music, I hope you'll make plans to join me at Reed Family Vineyards on July 27th for Crush MS. For more information or to buy your tickets, just visit crushms.org, and you'll find that link in today's show notes. In today's episode, we've talked about potential advances in stem cell therapy for progressive MS and how a simple blood test that analyzes a panel of 20 proteins can potentially make a difference in MS care. But those advancements become far less meaningful if you happen to be someone who won't benefit from early intervention. That initial understanding that you may be experiencing early signs of MS requires a different level of awareness among doctors and patients. My guest today has led the work in developing a tool to do exactly that. In a moment, we'll meet my guest, Dr. Jaime Imitola. Dr. Jaime Imitola is the director of the Division of Multiple Sclerosis and Translational Neuroimmunology at UCONN Health. And Dr. Imitola brings to today's conversation over 20 years of experience focused on progressive MS, along with expertise in the design, execution, and oversight of translational research trials for MS. Welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Imitola.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's been shown many times that early diagnosis and intervention lead to the best outcomes for people with MS. Unfortunately, it's also been shown that not everyone gains the benefit of an early diagnosis. Now, experts all seem to agree with that assessment. You and your team decided to do something about it, and that has led to VISBL-MS. So tell me, what is VISBL-MS all about?
Well, thank you. And the setup for this is this realization that not only in the United States, but around the world, we have 3 million people living with MS, and about 2 million of that 3 million, they live in places where they have access to medications and diagnosis. And there is a million patients around the world that may not be able to have the same type of access. Even in the United States, that we have 1 million patients with MS, we know that about 30 to 40% of the patients may not have the same access to care, and there are many, many barriers to prompt diagnosis. As you alluded, we have learned a great deal. We have done a great deal of progress in terms of MS regarding therapies, immunological therapies for MS, also prompt diagnosis, but this is not affecting people equally, and there are tremendous difference. And then the question is that people like to say, well, let's diagnose the problem, and we know that for many years now that there are barriers of care, etc. But we're thinking about how to implement, how to invent, or how to improve with inexpensive tools the early awareness of patients and families with multiple sclerosis. One of the most shocking things that we found in our investigation was that many medical students actually have limited access to basic education in multiple sclerosis. So if we're going to improve the workforce for the future of MS care, we need to start early. And then, therefore, what we wanted to do was produce a simple tool based on our investigation that can provide a framework or reference for both students and also in lay terms for families or patients that may have concern for multiple sclerosis. Now, in addition to that, in my years of looking at referrals from our family medicine doctors and other specialists, there is actually a misconception of what the early signs of MS are. And therefore, we wanted to put together this web tool that we call VISBL-MS. And VISBL-MS is not only that the quote unquote the translation of the so-called clinical associated syndromes in a way that many people can understand. So as you probably remember, and the audience remember, we have made a lot of progress, and now we have defined this clinical defined episodes where a patient has symptoms that may portend in the right demographic that these are multiple sclerosis symptoms, and they include the visual system, either loss of vision or painful loss of vision or double vision, and the B stand for balance, back or belly numbness, and the L stand for leg weakness or numbness. And since this is a bilingual tool, in the Y in English is for young, between 18 to 45, and the E in Spanish stands for the same age, edad in Spanish. So what we wanted to do is to have something straightforward that people can remember, and that people can memorize. In addition, that it can be translated seamlessly between English and Spanish.
As you just mentioned, this lack of awareness about multiple sclerosis doesn't only exist among the general public. Can you tell me what the term neurophobia is?
Yeah, that's a great point. Neurophobia is the fear of neurology in general, and what it means and what it implies. For instance, medical students, when they are in the second year of med school, they tend not to be interested in neurology because it is complicated, neuroanatomy is complicated, neurophysiology is complicated, etc. And when you become a doctor, then certain patients becomes very complex and difficult, and that's something that actually changes the perspective of our colleagues in medicine, that every time they see a patient with a neurological issue, they run for the exit, or they tend to misdiagnose many of those patients. So as you probably know, we neurologists, we have to have a basic understanding of, for instance, the heart and when to call a cardiologist. I don't think that that's true for other specialties. They tend to not really appreciate the basics of this. I mean, we have done that for years in a stroke, because a stroke has become, something that is very important to diagnose early. And yeah, we have succeeded, but we think that this can be expanded to other neurological issues, including multiple sclerosis.
Part of this initiative includes a paper that you and your team published on VISIBL-MS. In that paper, you call out some of the real-world barriers to MS diagnosis and treatment. Can you talk about what some of those barriers are?
Yeah, actually, thank you for that question. And let me put this in a fragment of reference. Over the last many years, I've been dedicated to understand multiple sclerosis at the molecular level, at the imaging level, and then at the clinical level, seeing patients. But one of my interests has been progression of the disease, right? I want to understand why the neurons, the stem cells, gets really damaged in multiple sclerosis. So about 10 years ago, I had an encounter with a patient that was actually had barriers to care, And it came to me like an epiphany. It's saying, well, I'm very interested in this area, but in the real world, there are people that are suffering right now, and they need a solution right now. So I started to study the barriers. The barriers are multiple, from education, from structural barriers for access to care, insurance, and the most important, I think, is lack of awareness, right? So, and I want to be very careful when I say education, because I don't want to sound condescending in the term. We all humans lack education about certain diseases. Right? Nobody knows, until you're diagnosed with something, nobody knows exactly what's going on. So my point to you is that we providers, or doctors, we have to actually provide a basic education to our patients so they can advocate for themselves. So, and that's what I mean by patient education. So is a commitment of the MS field to educate our patients to the basics knowledge that they need to self-advocate. And I think that I have articulated this very clearly, that we're not doing the right thing. We're not. We need to do better in our clinics, and because at the end of the day, there are multiple barriers, social determinants of health, etc. But we cannot wait until they are improved by others. We have to move ourselves, and we have to start by being more compassionate. There is this concept of discretionary efforts in inequity in healthcare, and that is that if you do a little bit, 1 more minute or 2 more minutes to help a patient, that provides additional help to this particular patient. So there are many barriers, and we can spend hours talking about one by one. But at the end of the day, I think that the MS field, my colleagues that are listening, and the patients, is that we need to do better. And doing better means be more compassionate and provide additional education to our patients.
And when it comes to, for instance, educating people, including medical professionals, to spot early signs, to spot symptoms that could lead to an MS diagnosis, well, that brings us to the subject of mnemonics. Can you explain how mnemonics have been successfully deployed to help identify other health conditions?
So what a mnemonic is in general for medical professionals is a word or a tool that helps memorize, some specific signs and symptoms, like FAST, F-A-S-T, in a stroke, that actually helps people to remember the face, the arm, the speech, and time, right? And that's something that can be helpful to the community. And all we want is the community to be empowered to kind of be alert. Remember one thing, and this is very important. We and others have done surveys, right? And in the surveys, we ask patients, so why it took you so long to get diagnosed? And then many of our patients of diverse communities, African American and Hispanic, said, well, my doctor said that since I am African American, I don't get MS, or that, quote, everything was in my head. So, end unquote. And then, so what I wanted to do with this tool is to empower the patient. I mean, I think that we have forgotten one important thing, is that when we empower the patient and we educate them, even with minimal education, that can be transformative. And I think that that's the most important goal of this. So the mnemonics, and by the way, the VISIBL-MS mnemonic is the first one in the MS field. And finally, what we have done is to put this framework in a card that can be given for free to either patients or medical students. So it's a little card that is plastified that can help. The card has some graphics that can explain what the symptoms are, and has a explanation of what it means, etc. But we want to provide this card for free to all the medical students and in the country. And we're in the process of doing a validation with medical students as well. So I think a mnemonic is helpful in the medical field, and I think that it's going to be very helpful to educate patients, especially MS patients with diverse background.
Well, as you pointed out, VISBL-MS is a bilingual initiative. Everything about VISBL-MS, including the paper explaining the need and importance of adopting this method of early identification of potential MS symptoms, everything has been published in both English and Spanish. What was the thinking behind that decision?
Yeah, so in not only in the United States, but in Latin America, there are some extraordinary areas of care, and in the United States, many of our people that live in the borders that might have Hispanic backgrounds, actually they might not be able to understand technical English, so they probably understand basics. Spanish. So one of the foundations for that was to reinforce English and Spanish in the same tool, in the same card, because you have basically the translation that the top is in English and the bottom is in Spanish. So you can actually know the words, that what it means is the same, right? But so that's important for the patients, but notably more for the students. Because, independing of where you are in the United States, the background, the diverse background can be from 1%, 2% if you live in the Midwest, or 10, 20, 30% if you live in the coast. If you live in the Southwest is probably 20, 30%. So the people that speak another language than English. So, and the majority of those people speak Spanish. So, for a student, they can use the VISBL card to basically use it for learning how to say the words in Spanish and English, because all the neurological symptoms are kind of translatable. They are in the same card. So I think that it will be important, for the student as they grow, having a basic vocabulary of MS that they can actually ask, do you have loss of vision in Espanol or in Spanish, right? And that will be very helpful. So everything was designed with a purpose to be reinforcing language, reinforcing cultural barriers. Even the figures of the person that is presented there is cultural appropriate. So all of that was done with the input of medical students, actually patients, other providers, and our team here at UCONN Health.
And now that VISBL-MS has been made available, what are the next steps?
Yeah, so there are two. We are in the process of understanding the impact of VISBL-MS in the community. So there is one project where we are using VISBL-MS to see whether or not medical students will retain more information in the process, and if that's the case, then we'll introduce VISBL-MS as a part of the curriculum in neurology here, at least in this institution, and the same for patients. So there is an ongoing validation, and every patient that is participating in these opportunities, they can identify themselves as a first symptom. One thing that is important to say, and this is very, very, very striking, there is a work by the Barcelona group that I think that is very important for us to keep in mind, is that since 1980s, 1990s, where we started diagnosing MS based on criteria until 2017, collectively, we have made a huge impact in the morbidity and mortality of MS. So there's no question that many people that actually lived in their young ages in 1980s will say that the patients with MS now looks different because they are not, going in wheelchairs as fast as in the past. So this is a very clear message that collectively we have done a great effort, but the reality is that effort doesn't really get to everybody, and that's a question. If you ask a European MS expert, they don't have the problem that we have in the United States. They don't have diverse populations, or they might have a small percentage of those patients. So therefore, the role that we're trying to play right now is to validate the tool and then learn from the patients now and publish these findings so we can actually extend this card, this VISIBL-MS tool everywhere in the country.
Well, Dr. Jaime Imitola, thank you for all you do, all you continue to do to improve the lives of people living with MS. And thanks for talking with me today.
Well, it's a pleasure. As I mentioned, John, you and your team, we are in the same goal, and that is trying to help our patients. And I think that there is a great opportunity through information, to research, to awareness. So, well, thank you for the kind invitation.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/358. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll pay a visit to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.